the
You're good to
Crocodile
go.
Dundee 2. You can't take my picture.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
It's not.
Will it take steal your spirit or something?
It's not gonna, you know.
I've got the link.
Not a very visual
I'm laughing
presentation.
up.
That'll be fine.
That's good. No, you don't need to do them all.
Not too dark.
No,
I can't see
no,
my
no, no.
notes.
Leave some of that up over there.
Got some atmosphere.
Yeah.
Right, now,
We hold
are we
that.
good to go?
Yes, you're good to go.
Afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. I found out later, I did these presentations a couple of times in the past, and they've found their way onto YouTube somehow. So, given YouTube's restrictions on things you can and can't say, I might make sure I don't say anything too controversial today in case it gets taken down or anything. But I'm not planning on saying anything that controversial. But if there's, if I have any sudden bouts of, thank you, amnesia, where I can't remember anyone's name or the name of a book or a researcher, it might be just to, you know, we don't want to upset YouTube, do we? I was reading the other day just Harold Weisberg said of Jim Garrison that he plagiarised his ideas and improvised on them until they were hardly recognisable, which is sort of what I'm about to do with an article by the gentleman behind me, which is George Michael Evica, E-V-I-C-A.
Oh, yeah.
Tremendous researcher. Malcolm Blunt's collection I've got to thank for this, because I bought a load of third decade periodicals, and these pre-internet era research-based periodicals I think are absolutely fantastic. There's a load of information in that I didn't know about, and unlike the publishing books, you haven't got the kind of angle that publishers need to sell books, like a whodunit or a theory. It's often just purely research-based, doesn't come to any real definite conclusions, but there's some great information in those. And I must confess I hadn't heard of this gentleman until about a year ago. I bought one of his books off Amazon after that, which was published I think about 2006, called A Certain Arrogance, or A Certain Kind of Arrogance maybe. That's a really good book that I've not come across, which is largely about Alan Dulles and company and their use of religious organisations and charitable organisations as front for intelligence work, which how it feeds into the Albert Schweitzer College and the Quakers and therefore the Paedons. And he's done some fantastic research into areas I'd never even thought of about connections between all these people, but a very, very intelligent researcher. So basically, the article I've based this presentation on was in the third decade, about 1985 it was published. It's about Jack Ruby. Essentially, he suggests that his connections, mainly in the world of organised crime, were very significant, and that Ruby himself was more significant than had been portrayed in certain quarters. So I suppose the thinking is, thus could these connections also be significant when looking into the Kennedy assassination? And I got a nice warm feeling from reading this article that he's close, in my opinion. He's close to the point. That's just my opinion. I think it was very good. So the Warren Commission, of course, concluded that Ruby's organised crime connections were basically insignificant. They suggested that the contacts were essentially connected to Ruby's financial difficulties, so they did mention that, particularly those with the IRS, that he had a tax debt, and also the mentioned about local nightclub competition. The evidence suggests this is true, but that it's not the whole truth. Then under HSCA, under Blakey, they were keen to promote organised crime in some capacity, but it was a very narrow remit that also didn't get into Ruby's wider associations. Blakey may have had his own reasons for not wanting to get into organised crime connections anyway. that's a bit controversial. Anyway, many researchers, also pro-conspiracy researchers, seem to feel the same way. I mean, I came into this case from the sort of Oliver Stone movie era, when most think it was really about the CIA, military, industrial complex and that kind of area, and the organised crime wasn't really that popular at the time. It's like in the movie where he kind of dismisses them as low level, and there's quite a lot of really good pro-conspiracy books and researchers who've kind of had Ruby sort of pigeonholed as a wannabe, they call him a peanut, don't they, in the sort of jargon of that he was sort of some kind of hanger-on to the bigger picture. But this article now, what I suggest is that he was quite a bit more than that. There we have Ruby's crowning moment. Evica says any serious student of the assassination can only conclude that Oswald was framed, then sacrificed. Okay? The real questions raised by Ruby's killing of Oswald were and remain: 1. Was Ruby in direct contact with key Teamsters and Syndicate figures just prior to the assassination? 2. Did these figures and associates encourage or coerce him to kill Oswald? 3. What were their motives? And 4. What leverage did they exercise on Ruby? And I suppose ultimately, if so, were these contacts significant in the great scheme of things? Note also there that he uses the phrases Teamsters and Syndicate. He doesn't say mafia or mob or anything like that. Organised crime is simply that. It was highly organised. It was a highly organised crime syndicate, and the Teamsters unions were sort of run alongside that. So he's not calling it the mafia like a lot of books do. We're talking here about cold, old-fashioned organised crime. So in the months leading up to the assassination, from about August 63 onwards, Ruby was in contact with several men. We'll get into these in a bit more detail in a minute, but there was Paul Red Dorfman, Erwin S. Viner, Robert Barney Baker, who called Ruby 10 days before the assassination, and Ruby had called Baker back twice. There was Murray W. Dusty Miller, Lenny Patrick, Nofia Pecora, Harold Tannenbaum, Joe Glasner, Lewis McWillie, Paul Roland Jones, Alex Gruber. Ruby was in contact with all these people. Now, ironically, the Warren Commission used Paul Roland Jones, Dave Yaros, Lenny Patrick and Paul Dorfman to testify on behalf of Ruby's good character. So they were kind of character witnesses in effect. They were at least to testify to his insignificant organised crime links. Evica states, quote, by choosing precisely those witnesses, the Warren Commission established a record of obstruction of justice for Dorfman, Yaris, Patrick, Jones and their associates had the most to lose if Ruby's real identity were exposed. So let's have a look at some of these in a little bit more detail. It's a bit of a rogues gallery, this is the... so Paul Red Dorfman was a ranking Chicago Syndicate member. He was close to the Chicago boss Tony Accardo. He took over the Chicago Iron and Junk Handlers Union as treasurer, and treasurer or company secretary, as we call them in this country more, with the actual power role in many unions, basically because they controlled the purse strings. Now, who was his predecessor in this role as an old friend was Jack Ruby. His stepson, Alan Dorfman, was also a Teamsters figure who was arraigned by the Bobby Kennedy crackdown on organised crime. He was Jimmy Hoffa's insurance delegate. Dorfman Sr. also opened up Accardo's Chicago operation to a Detroit-based Teamster friend, Jimmy Hoffa. So Dorfman then worked closely with Hoffa in Chicago as Hoffa assigned Teamsters insurance programs to the Dorfman family. So these are at the sort of top of the financial pecking order of the Teamsters. That is Erwin S. Viner. He was a close associate of a gentleman called Felix Aldericio, who was an Accardo delegate. Also admitted to working with Sam Giancana, was an intimate of Hoffa and Dorfman. In addition to handing bonding and insurance premiums for the Teamsters, he also held a large interest in 2 Havana casinos that were offered to him by his own ambition for, quote, services rendered on behalf of Aldericio and Santo Trafficante. He was also arraigned by RFK. Barney Baker, according to Bobby Kennedy himself no less, was one of Hoffa's roving ambassadors of violence. Sounds a lovely chap. He had worked for Frank Costello, who was associated with Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, and he was also Alan Dorfman's personal bodyguard. And Dusty Miller, Murray Miller, was Hoffa's personal Teamsters deputy to Dallas and New Orleans, and therefore connected to Carlos Marcello and Trafficante. He was head of what they called the Southern Conference of Teamsters, which included Dallas and the notorious Miami-based gang, the Local 320. And they've got quite a small photo of Lenny Patrick and Dave Yaros. These two gentlemen grew up with Ruby in Chicago, were gang members who were accused but acquitted of a murder which allowed Arcado and Giancarlo's syndicate to wrest control of the national race wire, which is very important in organised crime activity to control the horse race betting. Yaros later worked with the Chicago syndicate in its Havana operations. Business associates included the Lanskys, the Trafficante, and Yaros also helped organise the Local 320 in Miami. Both he and Patrick were senior assistants to Giancarlo. Now, in this article, Evica describes Trafficante as the Florida and Cuba mafia boss, yes, sponsored by Meyer Lansky, and later quotes a Lansky delegate. But this is important because the thinking is really that Trafficante and Marcello were essentially lieutenants of frontmen for Chicago, and that was a lot of books kind of have it the other way around, that they had the power. This is again just about the structure of organised crime, really. Nofio Pecoro was a delegate of Marcello, ran a number of his operations, as did Harold Tannenbaum, and then Louis McWillie, who I think you will have heard of from various books. He worked with the Lanskys, Trafficante and Yaros. He was in Cuba with them pre-Castro, and then after Castro took over, McWillie was reportedly employed by Giancarlo and later by Meyer Lansky in Las Vegas casinos. And Joe Glasner was also a former Chicago nightclub owner, and he was attorney Sidney Korshak's Chicago delegate. Now, Korshak is an important figure because he was, quote, the real power behind associate booking and had considerable leverage in the Chicago office of the show business union AGVA, all tied to Teamsters and Ricardo stroke Giancarlo. So organised crime controls show business as well as the race wire. Arthur Seymour Hush described Korshak, the lawyer, as, quote, one of the 5 most influential Americans linked to organised crime. And these are all people connected to Ruby by one step or another. Paul Roland Jones, who testified for Ruby at the Warren Commission, was another Ricardo Giancarlo deputy, as well as being an old friend of Ruby. And Gruber, Alex Gruber, was another old friend of Ruby, an associate of Frank Maciulli, was another syndicate-connected Teamsters official and friend of Jimmy Hoffa. So these are all people Ruby was in contact with on the months leading up to the assassination. In June 1963, Ruby was in New Orleans visiting delegates of Marcello. On the 6th of June 1963, Ruby's attorney Graham Cock called the Dallas IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, and told them that Ruby would be able to settle his tax debt, quote, no later than June 14th. That was within 8 days of this meeting. However, this plan appears to have fallen through. Ruby's meetings with organised crime figures in New Orleans and later Las Vegas, which I'll get to in a minute, appear to have included offers to settle his IRS bill. But what did he have to do in return? Whilst it's clear Ruby was in financial difficulties, and even given his earlier ties to this group, how was Ruby able to call on such powerful people at such a time of what we're told was personal stress, personal financial difficulties? Now, just a word about Dallas and organised crime. At the end of the Second World War, the Chicago Syndicate had tried to, in inverted commas, organise Dallas, i.e. to set up control of gambling, narcotics, race wire, and most importantly to corrupt local law enforcement officers, because no organised crime can exist without the cooperation of local law enforcement. The two of the delegates that were sent there were Paul Rowland Jones and Ruby. And Ruby, as we know, then took up residence in Dallas, and he established himself as a friend of the Dallas Police Department, DPD. He was a reliable informant for their special service, vice and narcotics operations, and, in quotes, the Dallas Syndicate connection for prostitution, numbers, gambling and gun running. So, back to 1963, in June 8th to 13th, 1963, there was a major syndicate meeting in Dallas. A number of Chicago organised crime figures known to be tied to the Arcado Giancana network arrived in Dallas, including, quote, one of the nation's top vice lords, presumably a member of the Vito Genovese family, landed without publicity at a private airfield south of Dallas to attend these meetings. Now, how do we know about these meetings? Well, we know because Lieutenant Robert May Jr. of the Dallas, he was the chief of DPD's vice squad, had submitted a confidential report to Chief Curry on the 16th of June 63, and the Warren Commission took no testimony from Lieutenant May. But more importantly to the focus of this, the group held meetings at 3 Dallas area venues. And what was one of the venues? Carousel Club. So Ruby was host for these important syndicate interstate meetings. During those meetings, Ruby also made calls to the syndicate meetings being held at Howard Johnson's restaurant in Arlington, Texas. That was another venue. The subject of these meetings, according to Lieutenant May's confidential report, was, quote, the organisation and protection of Dallas crime. So in other words, the syndicate figures from Chicago have come to Dallas to organise the whole thing from top to bottom. This made the Dallas Morning News in January '64, but of course was also ignored by the Warren Commission. Now, the FBI also knew about what was going on. Evica submitted a Freedom of Information request in order to receive a 3-page FBI report from Dallas Special Agent in Charge Gordon Shanklin to Hoover, dated 13th of January '64, so right at the beginning of the Warren Commission. The report is titled Criminal Intelligence Program, Dallas Division. And despite more than 2/3 of the report being redacted, there was enough there to verify Lieutenant May's report. So according to Evica, the FBI was aware of the syndicate meetings, their reported intent, the appearance of the important Eastern mobster and Ruby's involvement. No evidence indicates that the FBI pursued an investigation, nor did, of course, they submit any of the reports of these meetings to the Warren Commission. We have even more evidence to support this. Further to these sources, 2 Chicago detectives were also monitoring the meetings in Dallas. Officers Cisco, CISCO, and Kalinowski, they were in Dallas in the summer of '63, and they were there to investigate the June syndicate meetings. They met with a Dallas police informer. So who was the informer? The man who's been police intelligence informer for 24 years in Dallas, Jack Ruby. At precisely the same time, June 12th to 15th, '63, the Southern Conference of Teamsters was also taking place, headed by Dusty Miller, Hoffa's Southern Deputy, also being held in Dallas at the same time. These meetings included representatives of the Local 320, the Miami Gang. On the last day, a press conference was held at the Cabana Hotel, which Ruby was connected to. Now, the Dallas Cabana Hotel was built with Teamster pension money obtained via Alan Dorfman. So high-ranking Teamster spokesman lashed out at the Kennedys, denouncing RFK for his anti-Hoffa drive. Hoffa himself was reported to be in attendance. So between June 8th and 15th, '63, Teamster stroke syndicate forces were all meeting in Dallas, enjoying the hospitality of Jack Ruby and Jimmy Hoffa. So what was the agenda of these meetings, which certainly at least mentioned the Kennedys? Now, there is some suggestion that the meetings could have included talking about assassination of the Kennedys, but I'm not sure if there's any hard evidence for that. But there was certainly Kennedys were mentioned because of the Bobby Kennedy, the mafia crackdown that was going on at the time. If we come forward to November 17th, '63, Ruby's in Las Vegas 5 days before the assassination. He's believed to have visited Louis McWillie, who was connected to Lansky, Trafficante and Giancana. Ruby called McWillie at least 8 times in 1963. On 19th of November, 3 days before the assassination, Ruby again contacted his attorney, Graham Cock, again notifying him he would now be able to settle his tax debt. According to Cock, in quotes, Ruby had a connection who would supply him money. Ruby owed $40,000 to the IRS at the time. It was a lot of money in '63. And then on November 21st to 22nd, just to wrap this up, Jimmy Hoffa was in Miami. On the evening of the 21st at 6:17 p.m, Barney Baker, who had called Ruby himself 10 days earlier, phoned Dave Yaris while Yaris was meeting with Hoffa himself. And less than 24 hours later, the main four of the Teamsters and their cronies was dead. And Jimmy Hoffa Jr. has admitted that his father probably knew Jack Ruby. And of course, if you look at what happened in the 1970s, mid-70s, the suspicious deaths of some of these characters, Giancarlo Hoffa, Johnny Roselli, did they know too much? Now, strangely, Marcello and Trafficante weren't bumped off. So well, we don't really know which way around it was, but Ruby was a Chicago man through and through. He was only sent to Dallas to essentially to set up the organised crime there. Now, I read a book recently that was quite interesting. You know this book probably because it's called Act of Treason by Mark North, which is a very good book. But he has it where his hypothesis is that Marcello was the mastermind of the assassination plot, and that the Chicago people were not as powerful. I think there's more evidence personally suggests that it's more the other way around, and that the power was in Chicago of the Syndicate, and that Ruby was heavily tied to these people. So that's essentially the information I've got from the article. So it's got a fairly narrow focus on Ruby's associates. But cheers for listening to that.
Two names that of course those names appeared in the famous phone calls before the assassination when they bought. But two names that you didn't mention, which I'm sure everybody has heard of, are the two Josephs, Joseph Campisi and Joseph Chiavello. I mean, Chiavello was the first man to see Ruby in jail. He was the first man to visit him. Do you believe that, I forget the book now, but I remember reading a book which indicates that Chiavello was as high in the mafia organisation almost as Marcello. And that he was controlling Dallas. Do you, I mean, what do you think?
The take I have on organised crime is that the top man was Mayor Lansky, and that Marcello and Trafficante were essentially delegates of him, and therefore Chiavello, anybody working, that they controlled certainly the South in effect.
Would they have been at those meetings, do you think?
Probably not in person, but it suggests Jimmy Hoffa was there, so I don't know about probably not, but certainly people who were associated with the Chicago Syndicate were there at the Carousel Club.
Didn't Robert Kennedy say that Ruby's phone records read like the witness list for the Saint Rackets Commission?
Basically, yeah. And yet a lot of conspiracy authors say he was a wannabe, and it doesn't. But I don't see that personally. I think he was a trusted. He was a trusted official of the syndicate.
I don't think. I think I've discussed this with a few people. I don't think Jack Ruby particularly wanted to kill Lee Oswald.
Probably not.
He said, well, he phoned the Dallas police on the day before and spoke to Billy Grammer and told Grammer there's been a committee assembled and if he won't change the plan, we are going to kill him. And Grammer knew Ruby personally, and only after he'd heard that Ruby had shot Oswald did he connect the voice to the name. So
he might try to tip him off beforehand to change the transfer arrangements or something like that, quite possibly. But I think he was ordered to do it. So
at the beginning of your talk, Paul, you mentioned the third and fourth decade.
Yeah.
publications, just for interest of everybody. These are available on Mary Ferrell website. If you go on Mary Ferrell, look for them. They're all photocopied sort of.
Good.
On
There's
there,
also quite a chunk of the older DPUK echoes as well.
yeah.
In that same section on the
Right.
Mary Ferrell website.
Yeah.
Yeah. And these have a lot of useful information in
They're brilliant.
that's not quite like you get in a published book,
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
publishing houses tend to want some sort of
Sensationalism.
angle,
Yeah.
sex it up or whatever, whereas these are not, these are just the dry, you know, research materials really, and
Continuing inquiries and all that.
those are good. You draw your own conclusions from these. He doesn't really make a conclusion, but by presenting all these connections of different names and who they were associated with, it does start to, you start to see a repetitive pattern, really. But there's some great articles on all aspects of the case. It's like I never knew, for example, that Patricia Lambert had written pro-conspiracy articles prior to writing the book about, the false witness book about Garrison investigation, which is sort of anti-Garrison. But there's some of her work in third decade about Secret Service lapses and things like that. There's some great stuff in them.
Was there a particular issue you drew on for that one?
I've only had a chance to read about 3 of them all the way through, so I think that's March 1985, that one. It started in January 85, I think it's the first issue of the third decade. I've only read about the first 3 so far, because there's so much material that you can make notes on. Yeah. So.
I met him in 2003. Who that
Ivica.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
He came to Canterbury in 2004.
Really?
Yeah. Ian Griggs always
Give us a presentation at once.
ethic very highly.
I don't want to sound like a stuck record, but I think I've got a Lambert and a Vicky upstairs if anyone's interested. Buy them high and sell them cheap.
Passed away in 2007, but great research in areas that haven't often been, looked at.
So you're telling me Jack Ruby never killed Oswald because he wanted to spare Jackie Kennedy the agony of a trial?
I'm afraid
that what you're telling me?
I don't think that's true. No. I think
fell for that one hook, line and sinker.
no. I think he sadly not.